I have stood on the forecourt of Harrogate Palace for 11 years, and in all that time I have moved exactly 4 times when I was not ordered to. Once for a child who wandered under a horse. Once for a man with a knife. Once for a woman who collapsed in the August heat and no one else went to her. And once, the 4th time, on the 9th of March, when the King of Verun stood on a balcony above my head and said a name that was not the name anyone expected, and I felt my whole body go loose, like something inside me had been unbuckled. I want to tell you about that 4th time. Not the way the papers told it, not the way the historians will tell it, with their dates and their clauses and their constitutional significance. I want to tell you what it was like to be 12 feet below that balcony in a wool tunic that weighed 11 pounds, with my chin strap cutting into the underside of my jaw, watching 4,000 people learn something at the exact same second I did. Because I saw their faces. And I will never, for as long as I live, forget the sound a crowd makes when it stops breathing. The morning. It was cold that morning. Not dramatic cold, nothing that would make a story. Just that gray, wet, ordinary March cold that gets into the seams of your boots and stays there. The kind of cold where your fingers ache around the rifle and you spend the first hour of your watch trying not to think about your hands. I remember the pigeons. There were more than usual hunched along the palace railings like little gray judges, and one of them had a bad foot and kept lifting it. I remember thinking, absurdly, that someone ought to do something about that bird. That is what your mind does on a long watch. It goes small. It finds the pigeon. My name is Corporal Alexei Voigt. I serve in the 3rd Company of the King's Foot, the ones you see in the photographs, in the tall black caps and the red coats, standing so still that tourists genuinely ask each other whether we are real. We are real, we ache, we get bored, we have opinions we are not permitted to have. And that morning I had an opinion, same as everyone else in Verun had an opinion, and my opinion was the same as everyone else's, which was, it will be Prince Idris. Of course it would be Idris. Let me explain the shape of the thing quickly, for anyone who was not alive for it or not paying attention. King Oral VII had been on the throne of Verun for 31 years. He was 78. He had been ill since the autumn, properly ill, the sort of ill where the palace stops issuing bulletins because every bulletin is worse than the last. The public had not seen him since a garden ceremony in October, where he had sat down halfway through and pretended he had always meant to sit down. We all knew what was coming. A regency. Someone would have to hold the crown's authority while the king lived and could not rule. It is a strange and old and rather cruel arrangement. When you think about it, you are still king, but someone else signs in your name and everybody knows why. And when a regency comes, the country asks one question and only one. Who? There were 3 names in every mouth in Verun that winter. Prince Idris, the eldest, 44, handsome in the way that photographs are handsome, that is to say, better in a picture than in a room, charming, educated at the right schools. He had spent 9 years as patron of a great many charities and had opened a great many buildings and had, so far as anyone could establish, never once been in a room where the temperature was uncomfortable. The court adored him. The court had been raising him for this since he was 6 years old. Prince Thomas, the younger son, 39, a decent man, I think, genuinely, but a man who had made his peace with irrelevance somewhere around his 30th birthday and had rather relaxed into it. Nobody seriously believed it would be Thomas. Thomas did not seriously believe it would be Thomas. And then there was the 3rd name. Princess Marguerite. 51 years old, the middle child, the one who had never been forgiven for anything. I should tell you what Verun thought of Marguerite, and I should tell you honestly, because if I soften it you will not understand what happened on the balcony. Verun thought Marguerite was difficult. That was the word. It was always that word. It was in the papers, it was on the radio panels, it was in the mouths of men in pubs who had never met her and never would. Difficult, prickly, cold, not warm like Idris, not easy like Idris. Here is what difficult meant in practice. It meant that at 19, when the palace wanted her at ribbon cuttings, she went to the military academy at Sarn instead, and finished 11th in a class of 206, and every single one of the 205 others was a man. It meant that at 26 she was in the mud at Collin Ridge with a rifle company, and stayed there for 4 months, and came back with a scar on her forearm that she never once explained to a journalist, and a habit of going very quiet when people talked about the war as though it had been something noble. It meant she did not smile for photographs. She had been told repeatedly by press advisors to smile for photographs. She said, and I have this from a man who was in the room, so take it as you like, she said, I will smile when something is funny. It meant she had told a government minister, at a public function in front of witnesses, that his housing figures were a fiction dressed up in a suit, and had refused to apologize, and the palace had spent 6 weeks cleaning it up, and the minister's figures had turned out. This is the part everyone forgot, to be a fiction dressed up in a suit. It meant she was 51 and unmarried, and Varun could not forgive a woman that. It meant that when the newspapers listed the succession, they listed Idris, then Thomas, then Idris's children, and then sometimes Marguerite in a smaller font near the bottom, the way you list a relative you feel obliged to invite. She was a soldier who had been made into a joke. And the joke was that she was too hard, too plain, too unlovable to ever stand where her brother would stand. I want to be honest about myself here, because I think you deserve that. I believed it too. Not cruelly. I never said a word against her. I would not. I am a soldier and she is a soldier, and there is a thing between soldiers that does not need saying. But I believed it. I stood on that forecourt in the March cold and I thought, it will be Idris, and it will be announced at 11, and I will be off shift at 2, and I will get a hot meal, and life will carry on. That is the truth. I had no vision. I had no instinct. I had a pigeon with a bad foot and a hot meal at 2, and that was the whole of my imagination that morning. The crowd. They started arriving at 6. Not many at first, the sort of people who arrive at 6, which is to say the obsessives, the flag carriers, the woman who has come to every royal announcement since 1979 and has a folding stool and a thermos and a face like a fortress. She has been there for everyone. I have watched her be there for everyone. I have never spoken to her. She has never spoken to me. We have an understanding. By 8, there were maybe 600. By 9:30, there were 2,000. By 10, the mall was solid from the palace gates to the Victory Arch, and the police had put up the cordons, and the whole thing had that particular smell that a large crowd on a cold morning has, wet coats and coffee and the hot sugar stink of the vendor carts, and underneath it all faintly, the horses. And it was loud. That is the thing people forget. Crowds in Varun are not solemn. Someone had a radio. Someone else had a better radio. A group of students near the west railing were singing something badly and being told to shut up by an old man in a flat cap, and enjoying being told to shut up. There was a girl on her father's shoulders. 9, maybe 10. Red coat. She had a little paper flag and she was waving it at me specifically, and she had been waving it at me specifically for about 20 minutes, and every so often she would stop and say something to her father, and I could not hear it, but I could see her mouth, and I am fairly sure what she was saying was, "He hasn't moved." I did not move. But I want to tell you, and this is not in any account of that day, and it will not be, because nobody was writing it down. I want to tell you that I had noticed that child and I had a plan, and my plan was that at some point in the next hour, when nobody important was looking, I was going to blink at her. Just once, deliberately. Give her something to tell her friends. I never got to. The first strange thing happened at 10:14. I know the time because I heard the quarter bell from St. Ansel's afterwards. And I remember thinking, that was a minute ago. The strange thing was this: the Lord Chamberlain came out onto the forecourt. Now, you need to understand that this is like, I don't know how to put it for someone who has not lived inside the machinery of a palace. It is like watching the pilot of your aircraft walk out of the cockpit and down the aisle to check something at the back. The Lord Chamberlain does not come outside. The Lord Chamberlain is inside. That is the entire architecture of the man. On the morning of a great announcement, he is upstairs, in a room with a fire, with the document, doing whatever it is that men like him do to documents. He came out onto the forecourt, alone, no hat in that cold, and he stood about 15 feet from my post with his hands behind his back, and he looked up at the balcony. Just looked at it. For perhaps 40 seconds. And then he went back inside. I could see him from the corner of my eye, which is where I see everything, and what I noticed, what I could not stop noticing, for the next 45 minutes, was that his hands were not still. He had them clasped behind his back, in the way that men clasp their hands behind their backs to look calm, and the thumbs were going, round and round, over and over. A man does not do that when the announcement is the announcement everyone expects. I remember a thought going through me, cold and quick, like a draft under a door. Something has changed upstairs. The second strange thing was Colonel Rise. Rise commanded the foot guard on ceremonial duty, and Rise was, without exaggeration, the least interesting man I have ever served under, and I mean that as the highest compliment I am capable of. In 11 years I had never seen him hurry. I had never seen him raise his voice. He had a face like a closed door. At 10:40 Colonel Rise walked the line. He walked it fast, and when he got to me he stopped, which does not happen, which had never once happened in 11 years, and he stood in front of me for 2 seconds, and he said, very quietly, without moving his lips much, "Voight, whatever you hear, you are made of stone." And he moved on. Whatever you hear. I have replayed those 3 words several thousand times. I have never decided whether he knew, or whether he only knew that he did not know, and that this was worse. But my hands went cold inside my gloves and stayed cold, and it was not the March air. The third strange thing. At 10:52 the household began to assemble on the balcony, and this is where it started to come apart for the crowd as well as for me, because a crowd is a clever animal, and a crowd can count. They came out in the order they always come out in. The minor cousins first, filling the edges. Then the Archbishop of Tenley in his purple, who looked, and I say this with no disrespect to the church, like a man who has been asked to bless something he does not entirely approve of. Then Prince Thomas and his wife, and their 2 boys, one of whom was picking his nose and had to be stopped. Then Prince Idris. And the crowd roared. God, they roared. 4,000 people, and it came off them in one great warm wave, and you could feel it in your chest cavity physically, like standing near a speaker. He raised a hand. He gave them the smile. It is a very good smile, I want to be fair to the man. He waved, and the noise went up again, and someone near the front started a chant of his name, and it caught. 400 voices, 500, IDRIS, IDRIS, and the students at the west railing were jumping. And the little girl in the red coat was hammering her paper flag against her father's head in her excitement. And he was laughing, and it was joyful. I need you to understand that. It was genuinely, uncomplicatedly joyful. Those people loved him. They were not being cynical or political. They had come out in the freezing cold with their children to be part of something, and here it was, and it was happening. And then Idris stepped forward to the balcony rail. And a man in a black coat, I did not know him, I still do not know who he was, put a hand on Idris's arm and moved him back. I felt the crowd notice it about 1 second after I did. You could hear the noise change. It didn't stop. It sort of buckled, like a note being played on an instrument that has just gone slightly out of tune, and you cannot say what is wrong, but you know in your teeth that something is wrong. The chant faltered. Somebody kept going and then stopped, embarrassed, the way you stop clapping when you realize nobody else is. And Idris turned his head and looked at the man in the black coat. And I saw his face. I was 12 feet below and slightly to the left, and I saw his face, and I will tell you what was on it, and it was not anger. It was confusion. He did not know either. Whatever was about to happen, they had not told him. They had brought the man out onto the balcony in front of 4,000 people, and his own children, and they had not told him. And I do not care what you think of Prince Idris. I do not care that he had never in his life had to be uncomfortable in a room. That is a cruel thing to do to a human being, and I felt it, standing there, like a hand around my throat. Then the doors opened again, and King Oral came out. The king. The gasp that went up was not for the announcement. That came later. This gasp was for the sight of him. He was a small man now. That was the thing. That was what the 4,000 people saw, and what the cameras saw, and what the country saw 20 minutes later on the evening bulletins. This enormous figure, 31 years, the man had been on every coin in their pockets, on the stamps on their letters. His face was the wallpaper of their entire lives, and he came out onto that balcony, and he was a small old man. He had a stick. He had never had a stick. His neck did not fill his collar. His hands on the head of the stick were the hands of somebody's grandfather, and you could see the bones of them from the ground. Somewhere behind me a woman said, out loud, not meaning to, "Oh no." Just that, "Oh no." 4,000 people, and I heard her, and I think it was because everybody else had gone quiet at the same instant, and her voice went into the gap. He got to the rail. It took him a long time. 2 men helped him, and he let them help him, which I think was the bravest thing he did that day, because a proud man does not let you see him be helped, and he stood there, and he let 4,000 people and 11 million more at home watch him be helped to a rail by 2 men in gray suits, because he had decided that what he was going to say next mattered more than his dignity. I have thought about that a great deal since. That is what it is in the end. That is the whole job, deciding what matters more than your dignity. He put on his glasses. That got a small laugh, actually, a warm, sad, rippling little laugh, because he fumbled them, and he had always fumbled them. He had been fumbling his glasses on national television for 3 decades, and it was the most familiar thing about him. And I think in that moment 4,000 people all remembered at once that they loved him. Then he took a piece of paper from his breast pocket and unfolded it, and the paper shook. And the crowd went silent. Not quiet, silent. I have never heard anything like it before or since. 4,000 people in an open square in a capital city, and I could hear the pigeons on the railings. I could hear a car streets away. I could hear the flag on the west turret snapping in the wind, and the creak of the leather of my own belt as I breathed. The girl in the red coat had stopped waving. He spoke. His voice was thin. They had a microphone on him, but it was still thin, and it went out over that square and into the silence, and he said, "I have loved this country for 78 years. Pause, a long one, too long. Somebody in the crowd started to move forward, and a policeman put an arm out. I have served it for 31. It has been my honor. It has been." And he stopped. And he looked down at the paper, and he did not read it. He folded it back up. He put it in his pocket. And I heard from somewhere on the balcony above me, very faintly, a man's voice say, "Sir." And King Oral VII of Varun said, into a microphone, to 4,000 people in a square, and 11 million at home. I am going to say it in my own words, I think. I have had a great deal of advice about how to say this. All of it was very good. All of it was. He waved a hand. Dismissed 31 years of advisors with a wave of one liver-spotted hand. All of it was designed to make this go down easily. And I have decided that I do not want it to go down easily. I want you to feel it, because I have felt it every night for 4 months, and I do not see why I should be the only one. And that was when I knew. I did not know what I knew, but I felt the ground of the world tilt very slightly under my boots, and I thought clearly in words. I remember the words. He is not going to say Idris. The name, a regent, the king said, is not a decoration. He was looking at the crowd, not at the cameras, at the actual physical faces of the actual physical people in front of him. A regent is a person who will hold this country in their hands while I am not able to. And I have had to ask myself a question that I have avoided asking for a very long time, and the question is this. He gripped the rail. Which of my children would I trust with something that could break? Silence. Not who would be liked, not who would be easy, not who would look correct in the photograph. And I have thought about the photograph. I have thought about it for 4 months. I have thought of very little else. He turned his head, slightly, towards his right where the family stood. Who would I trust with something that could break? And the crowd, 4,000 of them, moved, all together. A great collective leaned forward, and I heard the barriers take the weight, and I heard the metal groan, and one of the police horses shifted and blew out through its nose. My son Idris, said the king, is a better man than I was at his age. I have never been more certain of anything than I was in that second that he was about to say it. That the strangeness had been nothing, and rise had been nothing, and the chamberlain's thumbs had been nothing, and it was going to be Idris after all. The crowd thought so too. They started to make a noise. And I have watched him, the king said over the noise, be a better man than I was, in every room I have ever put him in where the room was warm and the chairs were soft, and everybody had already agreed. The noise died. Died like a dropped glass. I have never, the king said, put him in a cold room. Nobody breathed. I want you to imagine 4,000 people and 11 million more, and none of them breathing, and a small old man on a balcony holding a rail with both hands. That is not his failing. That is mine. I did not put him in the cold room because I loved him, and I did not want him to be cold. And so I do not know what he is when he is cold. And I am 78 years old, and I am very ill, and I do not have time to find out. He turned his head the other way. To his left. But I know what she is. I heard the crowd make a sound I have never heard a crowd make. It was not a cheer, and it was not a gasp, and it was not a groan. It was all three at once, from different parts of the square, and it collided in the middle over my head like weather. Because they knew. Every single person in that square knew who she was, and not one of them had believed it possible until the exact half-second in which the word left his mouth. Because I did put her in the cold room, said the king of Verone. I put her in the cold room when she was 19 years old because she asked me to, and because I did not think she would last a winter, and because, I will be honest with you, and you may do what you like with it, because I was not paying enough attention to her to stop her. He was not reading. There was no paper. He had folded up the paper and put it away, and he was standing in the March cold at 78 years old saying this out of his own head. She lasted the winter. She lasted every winter I have ever thrown at her. I have thrown a great many, and I have thrown some of them on purpose, and I am ashamed of that now, and I will be ashamed of it for whatever I have left. A single voice from somewhere in the crowd, a man near the front, shouted something. I could not hear the words. It was not friendly. It did not sound friendly. The king heard it. I saw him hear it. He did not flinch. Yes, he said to that voice, just to that voice out of 4,000. Yes, I am aware of what you think of her. I have read it in your newspapers for 30 years. And then, and I swear to you, the temperature of that square dropped. You have called her difficult. You have called her cold. You have called her unwomanly in print in a national paper in the year of our Lord, and my daughter has never once in 30 years answered any of it. Not once. Do you know why? The square did not answer. The square could not. Because she thought it was undignified to defend herself while men were dying in the Ridge country. And so she said nothing. For 30 years. And you took her silence as agreement. I was made of stone. Colonel Rise had told me, whatever you hear, you are made of stone. And I stood there and I did not move a muscle and I did not shift my weight and I did not blink and my rifle did not tremble. And I want to be very clear with you, because this is the only boast in this entire account and I would like to be permitted it. I did not move, but my eyes were full. I could not stop that. There is no drill for that. There is no order that reaches the tear ducts. And I could feel it running cold down the side of my nose and into the corner of my mouth, and it tasted of salt. And I stood at attention in front of 4,000 people and 11 million cameras, and I let it run, because I could not lift a hand to it, and I would not have if I could. I appoint, said King Oral VII, as regent of the realm of Varun. He had to stop. He had to stop, because his voice broke, and he put a hand over his eyes for a moment, and the crowd let out a sound like a held breath finally going, and someone, a woman, started to cry loudly enough that I heard her over everything. He took his hand down. My daughter, Marguerite. After the name. I have been asked many times since what the crowd did. And the honest answer, the answer I gave to the commission, and the answer I will give to you, is nothing. For 4 full seconds, 4,000 people did absolutely nothing. No cheer, no boo, no sound at all. I counted them. I counted them because I had nothing else to do with my mind. 1, 2, 3, 4. And in those 4 seconds I looked out at that square and I saw 4,000 human faces trying to change shape and not knowing which shape to change into. I saw a man with his mouth open and nothing coming out. I saw 2 women turn to each other and just stare. I saw a boy of about 17 with his hands on top of his head, like a man watching a car crash. I saw an old soldier. I know an old soldier. I know the way they stand. I saw an old soldier at the west railing, 70 if he was a day, with a row of ribbons on his coat, and his face was doing something and I could not read it. And then he took his hat off. He took his hat off, in the cold, and he held it against his chest. And he was the first one. And then it started. It started at the back, which is strange, but it started at the back. I have thought about why, and I think it is because the back of the crowd is where the people stand who could not get to the front, and the people who cannot get to the front are, historically, not the people the palace has ever cared about, and perhaps they understood her faster. It came forward like a wave breaking backwards, like water going the wrong way up a beach. And it was not a cheer, not at first. It was applause. Just applause. Hard, flat, furious applause, thousands of hands, and it hit the front of the crowd and the front of the crowd turned around to see what was happening behind them. And then they turned back and they joined it, and it doubled again. And the pigeons went up off the railings all at once in a gray explosion, and the police horses tossed their heads, and somewhere a barrier gave way and nobody cared. And the noise came up off that square and hit the front of Harrogate Palace and came back down on us like rain. And under it, I heard the other thing. Because it was not all applause. There was booing. There was. I am not going to lie to you and tell you a beautiful lie. There were men in that crowd who booed the king of Varun on his balcony 4 months from his death for nomming his daughter. And there were people around them who turned on them. I watched a fight break out, 14 feet from my post. A man in a green jacket booing and a woman, I think a stranger, I do not think she knew him, screaming into his face and a police officer wadding in, and the man's friend pulling him back, and the woman still shouting, and I could not hear a word of it over the noise. That is what it was like. It was not a triumph. It was a country tearing, live in a square in the cold. And in the middle of all of it, I did the fourth thing. The fourth time I have moved on that forecourt without an order. The little girl in the red coat had fallen. The barrier had gone, the one that gave way. The one nobody cared about, and her father had been pushed forward, and she had come off his shoulders, and she went down between two adults into the churn of legs, and she was 9 years old, and nobody had seen her go down except me, because I was 12 feet away and I was facing them, and I have spent 11 years of my life learning to see everything without turning my head. I broke. I broke post in the middle of a national address in front of 11 million people, and I went down off the step and into the crowd, and I got my hands under her arms and I lifted her clean up out of it, and I put her on the step behind me, inside the line, where nothing could reach her. She was screaming. Not hurt, I checked. I checked her arms, I checked her legs. I have done this before in worse places, just terrified, and holding what was left of her paper flag, which was bent in half. And her father came through the barrier line white as paper, and I gave her to him. And he said, and it was the only thing he said, and he said it while he was crying, he said, "Thank you, thank you, thank you." And I said, "Get her up on your shoulders, sir, where you can see her." And I went back to my post, and I straightened up, and I did not move again for 2 hours and 11 minutes. The thing nobody, FILMED. Here is the part you have not seen. Here is the part that was not on any camera, because every camera in Varun was pointed at the king, or at the crowd, or at Prince Idris's face. And God, they ate Prince Idris's face. They replayed it for a week, and I have never forgiven the men who did that. But nobody was pointed at the doorway. I was. Because I stand facing the palace's own steps at a 3/4 angle, and behind the king in the dark of the balcony doorway, half in and half out, there was a woman standing very, very still. She had been there the whole time. She had been standing in that doorway in the shadow for the entire address. She had not come out. She had not been called out. Nobody in the square had seen her because she was 6 feet back from the light and she was wearing black and she had not moved. And when he said her name, when King Oral VII said my daughter, Marguerite, I watched her. She did not smile. She did not step forward. She did not raise a hand or look at the crowd, or do a single one of the things a human being does when they have just been given a kingdom. She put her hand flat against the door frame. That was all. That was the whole of it. She put one hand flat against the wood of the door frame beside her, the way you do when a room moves when you have stood up too fast, when the floor has come loose. And she stayed like that for a long moment with her head down. And then she took her hand off the frame and she straightened up, and she wiped her face once fast with the heel of her hand, one motion, hard, angry almost, the way a soldier does it when there are men watching and they must not see. I know that motion. I have made that motion. And then Princess Marguerite of Varun squared her shoulders and lifted her chin and walked out into the light. And that is where part 1 ends. Because what she did in the next 90 seconds is the reason we are still talking about the 9th of March. And I have to tell it properly, she walked out into it. That is the sentence. That is the whole thing, and I could stop there and you would understand, but I am going to slow it down because I have had years to slow it down and I want you to see what I saw. She came out of that doorway and into the light, and the noise hit her like weather. You have to understand what she was walking into. It was not a welcome. Half that square was applauding until their palms split, and the other half, not half, I am being generous to the ugly side, call it a third, the other third was booing. Booing a 51-year-old woman who had been shot at in the Ridge country while they were at home watching the football. And there was still a fight going on by the West Barrier. The man in the green jacket, the woman screaming into his face. Two officers on them now and a third coming, and a section of the crowd had opened up around it the way crowds do, that ugly little clearing that forms around violence, and everyone in that clearing was shouting. That is what she walked into. Not a coronation, a brawl. She stopped at the rail, and she did not raise her hands. That is the thing I keep coming back to. Every royal I have ever stood beneath in 11 years has raised their hands to a crowd. It is the reflex. You come out, the noise comes up, you lift your hands, either to gather it in or to quiet it down, but you lift them. She kept hers on the rail. She put both hands on that rail, flat, wide apart, the way you brace a table you think is going to fall. And she stood there. I could see her from below and slightly behind, which is a bad angle for a face and a good angle for everything else. And what I saw was this. Her back was straight, not proudly straight, braced straight. That is a different thing, and any soldier will tell you the difference. Proud is the chest, braced is the spine. She had the spine of a woman standing into wind. Her jaw was locked. I could see the muscle of it working. And her right hand, the one nearer to me, the one with the scar running up the inside of the forearm and disappearing into the black sleeve. Her right hand was gripping that rail hard enough that the knuckles had gone white and stayed white. The rest of her was iron. That hand was the only part of her that was telling the truth, and only I could see it, because I was 12 feet below and nobody else in the world was looking at her hands. She did not speak. They expected her to speak. The chamberlain expected her to speak. I could see him at the edge of the balcony, half a step forward, doing the thing that men like him do with their eyebrows when the plan is not being followed. The archbishop expected her to speak. He had his hands together and his head slightly bowed, ready to be spoken over. The crowd expected her to speak. You could feel them expecting it. The booing had a shape to it now. It was leaning in. It was waiting to shout down whatever she said. That is the trap. That is the oldest trap in the world, and every woman I have ever served with knows it in her bones. They make a noise at you, and then they wait for you to shout over the noise, and then they say, "Look how shrill she is." She had 30 years of practice with that trap. She did not speak. She waited. I want to tell you how long she waited, and I want you to actually count it, because when I say the number, people nod and say yes, that must have been uncomfortable, and they do not understand. 3 minutes and 40 seconds. Go and stand in a room right now and do nothing for 3 minutes and 40 seconds. Do not check anything. Do not shift your feet. Do not look away. Just stand and be looked at by 4,000 people, a third of whom hate you. It is an eternity. It is unbearable. 90 seconds in, your own body starts to betray you. You want to shift. You want to touch your face. You want to give them something just to make the looking stop. She gave them nothing. She stood at that rail with her hands flat and her chin level, and she looked out over the square. And she did not scan the crowd the way politicians scan a crowd. She did not seek out the friendly faces. She looked at the booing. She turned her head slowly, deliberately, towards the west barrier where the fight was, and she looked at it. And she let them see her look at it. The first thing to go was the booing at the back. Boos need company. That is the truth about them. A boo is a thing you do because the men around you are doing it, and when you have been doing it for 2 minutes and the woman you are booing has not flinched, has not spoken, has not so much as blinked, and is simply standing there looking at you, you start to feel like the one being watched. You start to hear your own voice. And it starts to sound stupid. The back of the square went quiet first, and then the middle, and it moved forward in patches. A whole knot of men going silent all at once near the fountain, and then the students at the west railing, who had been the loudest of the lot and were suddenly, visibly, mortified. The applause faded too. That is the part nobody expects. The applause went as well because you cannot applaud into a silence like that either. It felt wrong. It felt like clapping in a church. At 2 minutes and 50 seconds, the only sound left in that square was one man. The man in the green jacket. The one who had started the fight. He had shaken off the officers, or they had let him go. I do not know, it was chaos down there. And he was standing in that ugly little clearing with his face red and his neck corded. And he was still going, and he was the only one. And everybody could hear him. Everybody could hear him. I will not repeat exactly what he was shouting, because there was a child on the step behind me and there are children who will hear this. But the shape of it was that she was a woman and that it was a disgrace, and that her father was senile, and that she should go back to her horses. And the square heard it. 4,000 people in silence heard exactly what he had been saying all along, without the cover of the noise. And you could feel it. I felt it come off them like heat. You could feel 4,000 people be embarrassed at the same time. Not for her. For him. He stopped. He stopped mid-sentence because he heard himself, and he looked around, and there was not a single other voice in that square, and everyone within 30 feet of him had stepped back and was looking at him with the flat, disgusted, "What are you?" look that a crowd gives a man it has finished with. And he went red, properly red, and he put his hands down. And a young woman standing beside him, a stranger, I am certain of it, a girl of about 20 in a yellow scarf, said something to him. Quietly, just to him. I do not know what she said. But he took a step back, and he did not look up again. And then there was silence. Real, total, 4,000-person silence, on the 9th of March in the cold, in the square in front of Harrogate Palace. And Princess Marguerite of Verone had not said one word. The 11 words. She let the silence sit for another 20 seconds after she had won it. That was the cruelest thing she did all day, and the most brilliant, and I do not think she planned a second of it. I think it was simply what a soldier does, which is, do not move until the ground is solid. Then she leaned very slightly towards the microphone. And she said, "I did not ask for this. I will not enjoy it. I will do it." That was it. That was all of it. 11 words. I have read the accounts. I have read the constitutional histories and the biographies and the long essays about what those 11 words meant, and about the tradition of laconic address in Veronish military culture, and about how they echo the accession statement of Queen Havard in 1611, which I am told they do, and which I am also fairly certain Marguerite had never read in her life. And I have never once seen anybody get it right. Because it was not clever, it was not designed, it was not a line. It was a report. That is what it was. I knew it the instant I heard it because I have heard 1,000 of them. That is a soldier standing in front of an officer with mud on her and giving the situation as it actually is, without decoration, because decoration gets people killed. I did not ask for this. That is her telling you she is not ambitious, and it is true. I will not enjoy it. That is her telling you she is not going to pretend, and it is true. I will do it. That is a woman putting her hand on the thing that is going to break her, and picking it up anyway. And she stepped back from the rail. And she turned to her father. And in front of 4,000 people and 11 million more, in the silence, Princess Marguerite of Verone stopped being a regent for about 4 seconds and was somebody's daughter instead. She took the old man's hand off the head of his stick, and she held it in both of hers. And she bent her head down over it. And her shoulders went. That is the photograph. You know the one. Everybody knows the one. It has been on the front of every newspaper in the world, and it is on the wall of my daughter's school, and it is on a postage stamp. A 58-cent stamp, which my sister thinks is funny, because she says that woman was never worth less than 100. The old king, small in the gray light, with his other hand coming up, very slowly. You can see the tremor in it even in a still photograph. coming up to rest on the back of his daughter's bowed head. And the daughter with her face down over his hand, and her eyes shut, and her mouth doing something that is not a smile and not a sob but the thing that lives between them. 4,000 people watched that. Not one of them made a sound. The old soldier. And then from the west railing, one voice. Not a cheer. The Regent. The old soldier. The one who had taken his hat off. 70, if he was a day, with his ribbons on his coat and his hat in his hand, and he had put it back on his head at some point. I did not see when, and now he took it off again and he held it up, and he shouted it into the silence with a parade ground voice that 70 years had not touched. The Regent. And every soldier in that square answered him. I do not mean the guard, we did not move. We are stone, that is the job. I mean the old ones, the ones in the crowd, the ones in the flat caps and the anoraks with the ribbon bars pinned on, the ones from the ridge country, the ones who had been 19 in the mud with her, and I had not even noticed how many of them there were until that second. And they came back at him out of every corner of that square, ragged, unrehearsed, 400 old men and a good number of old women, and it went up like a wall. The Regent. And then the crowd took it. And then it became a roar. I have never heard anything like it, and I never will again. 4,000 people in an open square, and it was not applause and it was not a cheer. It was a shout, one word, over and over, and it came up off the stones and it went up the front of the palace and it went out over the rooftops of the Capitol. And inside my chest, my own heart was going so hard I could feel it against the wool. The pigeons had gone. There was not a bird left on that railing. The little girl in the red coat, on the step behind me, inside the line safe, was screaming it with the rest of them in a voice like a kettle, and she was holding up her bent paper flag, and her father had his arm around her and he was shouting too, and he was crying, and he did not care who saw. The forecourt. The balcony emptied. It took about 10 minutes because it takes an old man 10 minutes to leave a balcony. They got him inside. Idris went in, and I will say this for Prince Idris, and I want it on the record. He went to his sister first. He did, I saw it. Whatever he was feeling, and God knows what he was feeling, in front of 11 million people, on the worst morning of his life. He crossed that balcony and he put his hand on her shoulder before he went inside. He did not embrace her. It was not a beautiful moment. It was two people who have not been close in 20 years, and one of them has just taken the other's entire life. But he crossed the balcony. That is more than most men would have done, and I have thought about it many times, and I think it cost him more than anything he had ever done in his life, and I do not think a single person has ever given him credit for it. The crowd took 2 hours to clear. I stood my post. Of course I did. That is what the post is. The world can turn upside down and the post is still the post, and I stood in the March cold with the wet coming up through my boots and my eyes still stinging and my hands numb, and I watched 4,000 people go home changed. By 1:30 there were only the stragglers, the photographers packing up, 2 men from the cleaning contract picking flags out of the fountain. The woman with the folding stool and the thermos folded her stool. She looked at me on her way past. For 11 years, that woman had never once looked at me. She stopped. She looked me in the face properly the way you look at a person, and she nodded once, just once, and she went home. At 2:10, the great doors behind me opened. I heard them. You always hear them. They are enormous and they are old and they announce themselves. And I heard boots on the step. Not shoes. Boots. And I knew before I knew, because there is only one person in that entire building who walks like that, and it is the walk of somebody who learned to walk in a place where the ground is uneven and you are carrying weight. Princess Marguerite came down the steps of Harrogate Palace and stopped 6 feet in front of me. What she said. I was made of stone. Rise's order was still standing and nobody had cancelled it, and I was on post, and she was, as of 11 o'clock that morning, the acting sovereign authority of the realm of Varun, and I was a corporal, and I did not move, and I did not look at her. I looked straight ahead, over her shoulder, at nothing. She stood there for a while. She was in the same black. She had a coat over it now. Her face I saw it in my peripheral vision, and it was gray, not pale, gray. The color a face goes when you have been holding it still for 6 hours. She said, "You broke post." I said nothing. You do not answer that. There is no answer to that. It is a fact, and she had stated it, and I had done it in front of 11 million people. And I had known when my boot left that step exactly what it would cost me, and I had decided that it was worth it, and I would have done it again. 11 years gone. I stood there and I waited for it. 14 minutes past 11, she said. You came down 2 steps. You went into the crowd to about your waist. You lifted a child out of a barrier collapse and you put her behind your own line, and you returned to post, and you were stationary again in under 9 seconds. I want you to understand what that meant. She had been on that balcony. She had been standing in the doorway with her hand flat on the frame while her father gave her a kingdom. She had walked out and stood in 3 minutes and 40 seconds of hatred, and she had held the hand of a dying man in front of the world. And she had seen it. She had seen a corporal 12 feet below and to the left, out of the corner of her eye, in a square containing 4,000 people, and she had counted the seconds. That is what she is. That is exactly what she is, and it took the country another 2 years to work it out, and I knew at 10 past 2 on the 9th of March. Look at me, Corporal. That is an order. I looked at her. She had gray eyes and there was nothing in them at all. Nothing. She was not angry and she was not warm and she was not anything. She had a face like the door of a bank. Do you know what they will say about me, she said, for the next 30 years? I said, no, ma'am. They will say I was cold. She said it flatly, not bitterly, like reading a weather report. They have said it for 30 years already, and they will not stop now. They will say I am hard and I am not warm and I do not smile and there is something wrong with me. She let that sit. They will not say it about Idris. Idris is warm. Everyone agrees Idris is warm. She looked past me, at the empty square, at the fountain with the flags in it. But Idris did not see that child. I did not breathe. He was on that balcony, she said. So was the chamberlain. So was the archbishop. So were 11 million people with the entire square on their television screens and a great many cameras, and not one of them saw a 9-year-old girl go down under a barrier. She looked back at me. You did, and I did. And then she said the thing. She said it very quietly, and there was nobody else on that forecourt, and no camera has ever recorded it. And I have never told it to a journalist, and I never will. And I am telling it to you now because I am old and I have decided somebody should have it. She said, warmth is what people call you when they are watching your face. Care is what you do when nobody is. She let it land. I have never had the first one. I have stopped wanting it. I intend to spend whatever is left of my life on the second, and I expect it to make me very unpopular, and I have made my peace with that, and I did it a long time ago in a place with a great deal of mud in it. Then she stepped forward, and she reached out, and she put her hand flat on the front of my tunic over the heart, over the red wool, and she left it there for about 2 seconds. And she looked me in the eye and she said, you will not be disciplined, not by me and not by anyone. If a man comes to you about the 9th of March, you send him to me, and I will explain it to him in language he will remember. She took her hand away. And Corporal, you were crying. On camera. 11 million people watched a King's Foot guard stand at attention with tears on his face and not lift a hand to wipe them. She stepped back. That was the finest piece of soldiering I have seen since the Ridge. Afterwards, she turned and she went back up the steps of Harrogate Palace, and the great doors closed behind her, and she began the 6 years that everybody now writes books about. She was not popular, she never became popular. She was right, which is a different thing and a colder thing, and it does not sell newspapers. She was right about the flood defenses in the Low Country, which she ordered rebuilt at enormous cost and against unanimous advice, 11 months before the winter of the Great Flood, and the papers called it a vanity project until the water came and 40,000 people did not drown. She was right about the hospital contract, and she was called vindictive. She was right about the Northern Railway, and she was called obstinate. She was right about the Chancellor, and she was called paranoid, and then she was called quite right, in hindsight, in very small print on page 11. King Oral VII died in the October. She was with him. There is no photograph. And Varun spent 6 years being furious with the woman who was saving it, and I stood on that forecourt through all 6 of them, and I do not think I ever once saw her smile in public. She said she would smile when something was funny. She was not lying. She was never lying. That was, in the end, the entire trouble with her. The last thing. I am 59 now. My knees went in the 8th year and they moved me indoors, which is a kind of small death for a man who has stood outdoors his whole life. I have a daughter. She is 19. She is at the military academy at Sarn, which was not my idea, and which I did not encourage, and which I could not have stopped if I had tried, and I did not try. She rang me last month. She had come 11th in a mathematics examination, and she was furious about it, and she said, "Dad, I was one place off." And I laughed at her, and she got angry at me for laughing, and I did not tell her why I was laughing. I did not tell her that a woman came 11th at Sarn once, out of 206, and every other one of them was a man, and that woman held a kingdom in her 2 hands for 6 years and gave it back whole. She will work it out. She is clever. She will get there. The girl in the red coat found me once. 9 years after. She was 18 by then, and she came to a public open day in a summer dress, and she waited 2 hours in a queue to speak to me, and she said, "You won't remember me." And I said, "You had a paper flag and it got bent." And she cried right there, in front of everybody in the sunshine. She is a nurse now, in the Low Country, in one of the towns that did not drown. People ask me what it was like. They mean the balcony. They mean the 11 words and the photograph and the roar. They want me to tell them it was magnificent. It was not magnificent. It was cold, and it was frightening, and a country tore itself in half in front of me over a square of wet stone, and I stood in the middle of it with tears on my face and a rifle in my hands, and I have never been more afraid in my life. But I will tell you the thing I have never been able to explain to any of them, and it is this. I have stood in front of that palace for 11 years, and I have watched a great many powerful people go up those steps. And nearly all of them were being watched. She came down the steps at 2:10 in the afternoon, when the square was empty, when the cameras had gone home, when there was nobody there but a corporal with wet boots who had ruined his career, and no photograph to be had, and nothing whatsoever to be gained. And she came down anyway, to tell one man, whose name she should not have known, that he had done the right thing. Warmth is what people call you when they are watching your face. Care is what you do when nobody is. She was the coldest woman in the history of Varun. She was the only one who came down the steps.